just a couple beers was once an acceptable prelude to getting behind the wheel. After a backyard barbecue or a stop at the local tavern, plenty of folks would climb into their cars without a second thought. Police might wave you through at a checkpoint if you seemed steady enough. People didn't talk about blood alcohol levels. They just said, "I'm fine to drive." Today, the thought of it sends a shiver down your spine, but back then, it was as common as stopping for gas on the way home. If you lit up a cigarette in a hospital waiting room today, you'd be escorted out in seconds. But in the 50s, there were ashtrays on the tables, and people puffed away while waiting for the doctor. Nurses walked by, doctors too, and nobody said a word. You could smell that mix of disinfectant, coffee, and cigarette smoke, a smell you just don't forget. It's hard to imagine now with our fresh air lobbies and no smoking zones. But back then, it was simply part of the atmosphere, the haze curling up under the harsh fluorescent lights while folks flipped through dog-eared magazines. Back then, nobody blinked at seeing a half-dozen kids bouncing around in the open bed of a pickup truck, even on the highway. No seat belts, no roll bars, just the wind in your hair, holding on to the side as the truck rattled along. It felt like the ultimate freedom, riding under the open sky, waving at passing cars. Today, it'd get you pulled over faster than you could climb in. But in those days, it was just another part of small-town life, and somehow we all made it home in one piece, sunburned and grinning from ear to ear. Fall meant raking up mountains of crispy leaves, piling them in the street, and setting them alight. The smoke curled lazily into the cool air, carrying that unmistakable smell of burning leaves. Neighbors might stand around and chat as the embers crackled, no one thinking about air quality alerts or fire codes. Kids poked at the piles with sticks, watching them smolder. It was one of those small seasonal rituals that made the neighborhood feel alive. Nowadays, you'd get a citation in most places, but back then, it was just part of autumn, right alongside pumpkin pies and football games. Changing your own oil meant getting under the car in the driveway, wrench in hand, and when it was done, you dumped the used oil down the storm drain or in a corner of the yard. Nobody thought about groundwater or the environment. It was just the way you did it. The smell of that black, used-up oil was a badge of maintenance. Sometimes you'd see rainbow sheens floating in the gutter after a rain, and it barely registered. Today, we drop it off for recycling. But back then, you handled it yourself and didn't lose a wink of sleep over it. Carrying a pocket knife into a courthouse or onto a plane didn't raise eyebrows. It was just another everyday tool. Men carried them to sharpen pencils, cut string, or open packages, and boys often had smaller ones clipped to their belts. Security checks were minimal, more about making sure you weren't smuggling in a radio than anything sharp. At the airport, you walked straight to your gate with your knife in your pocket, and no one cared. It wasn't seen as dangerous. It was practical. The idea that it could land you in serious trouble today would have sounded ridiculous back then. Cars didn't come with seat belts as standard, so kids roamed the back seat or sat right up front on the bench seat's fold-down armrest. It was the best seat in the house, perched high with a clear view through the windshield. Parents drove with one arm across you in a sudden stop, and that was the safety feature. We didn't know about crash tests or restraint systems. It was just family travel, and if you were lucky, you got the armrest thrown the whole ride to Grandma's. Lighting a cigarette at 30,000 feet wasn't just allowed. It was part of the flying experience. Airplanes had ashtrays built right into the armrests, and that faint haze of tobacco smoke mingled with the scent of coffee and jet fuel. Flight attendants offered matches, and nobody mentioned second-hand smoke. You could sit back, cross your legs, and puff away while reading a magazine. Even in coach, it felt glamorous, like you were part of an exclusive club. Now, the idea of smoking on a plane is unthinkable, but back then it was simply what you did to pass the time in the air. Tossing trash out the car window wasn't just something careless people did, it was practically normal. Candy wrappers, soda bottles, even fast food bags went flying without a second thought. Highways and back roads alike had litter in the grass, and nobody called it pollution. You might see Boy Scouts out on cleanup days, but otherwise it stayed where it landed. It wasn't until later that campaigns like Keep America Beautiful started changing minds. Back then, the road just swallowed up whatever you tossed, and the idea of bringing it home with you felt downright unnecessary. Fireworks in the street were a neighborhood event. On the 4th of July, dads lit bottle rockets and firecrackers right there on the pavement, kids circling around barefoot. Sparks flew, paper scraps littered the road, and nobody cared about fire marshals or city permits. It was noisy, smoky, and magical. The only safety equipment was a bucket of water, if that. These days, you'd have to fill out forms or head to a designated zone. But back then, your block was your fireworks show, and everyone came out to watch. Fishing was about grabbing a pole, a can of worms, and heading to the nearest pond. Licenses and size limits technically existed, but most folks ignored them for casual fishing. Kids learned to bait a hook before they could write their names, and nobody from the game warden's office was likely to bother you. The joy wasn't in the rules. It was in the quiet water, the tug on the line, and the hope of catching the big one before supper. In plenty of states, you could drive around without car insurance and nobody would stop you, until you had an accident, of course. Insurance wasn't yet the automatic requirement it is now, and many folks figured they didn't need it if they were careful. Some swore they'd never had a fender bender in decades, so why pay for a policy? Police might not even ask for proof unless something happened. Today, the thought of being on the road uninsured sends shivers down your spine, but back then, it was just one more thing you could skip to save a few bucks. Before the slow-moving vehicle emblem was introduced in the early 60s, tractors just rolled down the road with no warning signs at all. You might come around a bend at full speed and find yourself behind one, chugging along at 10 miles an hour. Farmers drove them into town, kids riding along on the fenders. Drivers just slowed down and passed when they could. Now, every farm vehicle sports a bright orange triangle, but back then, the only signal you had was the sound of the engine and a plume of diesel smoke up ahead. Letting a kid ride on your lap while you drove was common enough that nobody blinked at it. Little hands gripped the steering wheel while Dad worked the pedals, and you helped steer down the street. It felt like you were driving the whole car, even if you barely reached the dashboard. Neighbors waved, no one scolded, and you sat back afterward feeling about 10 years older. Lead-based paint was everywhere, in houses, schools, playgrounds. The bright, glossy colors seemed perfect for walls, furniture, and even cribs. Nobody knew, or at least nobody talked about, the health risks. The smell of fresh paint was just part of home improvement, and kids sometimes helped stir it up. Today, we scrape, seal, and test for lead dust. Back then, it was just another can at the hardware store. Parents used to wave goodbye in the morning, and that was it. You were on your own until supper. Kids roamed blocks away from home, climbed trees, played in creeks, and explored construction sites, all without a phone or constant check-ins. You learned the lay of the land, who had the mean dog, and where you could get a drink of water. The only rule was to be back when the street lights came on. No GPS trackers, no anxious texts, just a kind of freedom kids today can hardly imagine, and a trust that you'd find your way home just fine. Riding a bike in the 50s meant feeling the breeze on your bare head and the gravel under your bare feet. Helmets weren't on the radar, and plenty of kids ditched shoes in summer entirely. You learned to avoid skidding on loose stones and to hop back up quick after a spill. Knees were always scraped, elbows scabbed, and no one made a fuss. It wasn't about safety gear. It was about freedom, the clatter of your playing cards in the spokes, and the thrill of racing your friends down the steepest hill in town. You felt alive, and that was enough. Sending a kid to the corner store for cigarettes wasn't shocking. It happened all the time, even though most states already had laws against selling to minors. Some shopkeepers looked the other way, others didn't care. You'd hand over the cash, get the pack, and walk home without anyone batting an eye. Sometimes you even bought them from vending machines, the coins clinking in the slot. Nobody carded you, nobody lectured you. It was just another chore, right alongside grabbing a quart of milk. Today, it's unthinkable, but back then, it was simply one more errand on the neighborhood kids' to-do list. Hitchhiking wasn't just for drifters. It was how a lot of folks got from place to place. You stuck out your thumb, maybe made a cardboard sign with your destination, and waited. Cars slowed down. Drivers asked where you were headed, and you piled in without a second thought. It could be a farmer, a salesman, or a family on their way to the next town. Most rides were friendly, sometimes even offering you lunch. There was risk, sure, but people saw it as neighborly, not dangerous. Today we'd call it reckless. But back then, it was just part of the open road. Some schools had their own rifle clubs, complete with indoor ranges. Students, sometimes in middle school, would bring their .22 caliber rifles from home, cases slung over their shoulders, and check them in with a teacher or coach. Safety lessons were serious, but nobody panicked at the sight of a firearm on campus. Competitions were held in the gym basement or out on the football field. It was a point of pride to hit the bullseye, and the whole thing felt as ordinary as the debate team. Today, the thought alone would make headlines, but back then, It was just another after-school activity. A cold beer at lunch on the job was no scandal in the 50s. Factory workers, salesmen, even office employees might duck into a tavern for a pint before heading back to work. It was seen as a way to unwind, not a safety hazard. Sometimes the boss joined in. The work still got done, and nobody was checking blood alcohol levels. Now, HR would have a fit, but back then, it was part of the daily rhythm, just like coffee breaks or smoke breaks. You didn't think twice about it, and neither did anyone else, as long as you punched back in on time. People left their front doors unlocked for days, sometimes even while on vacation. Neighbors kept an eye out, and if anyone knocked, they were just as likely to walk right in. Trust was part of the fabric of life. You knew who lived on your street, and everyone knew you. Today, we lock everything twice over, install cameras, and still worry. But back then, the idea of needing that much security felt almost insulting, like you didn't believe in the basic decency of the people around you. You relied on community more than locks, and somehow it seemed to work. Smoking in a movie theater wasn't frowned upon. It was part of the ambiance. The beam of light from the projector cut through a smoky haze, making the air look almost magical. People lit up during the previews, during the feature, and sometimes even during the credits. Ashtrays were built into the seats, and the smell lingered long after the last reel. Teachers could paddle students for misbehavior, and most parents backed them up. A wooden paddle hung behind the teacher's desk, and the threat of it kept plenty of kids in line. It wasn't seen as controversial. It was discipline. Today, it'd cause outrage, but back then, it was considered part of teaching respect. Dogs roamed freely, trotting from yard to yard and house to house like they owned the whole street. Some wore collars with tags. Others had nothing but a familiar bark to identify them. They'd nap on porches that weren't theirs, drink from any water bowl left out, and follow kids halfway to school just for company. You learned quickly which ones might chase your bike and which would trot along beside you like an old friend. Nobody called animal control unless there was real trouble. Most stray dogs already had an unspoken arrangement with the neighborhood. They belonged everywhere, and somehow to everyone. Backyard tree houses were slapped together from whatever scrap wood you could find. Old fence boards, packing crates, maybe a few nails bent straight again. Safety rails? Not a chance. A couple of shaky planks nailed to the trunk made your ladder, and if they wobbled, well, you climbed faster. Parents rarely hovered or offered building tips. You learned through trial, error, and the occasional dropped hammer. A loose board underfoot just meant the floor had character. Sitting up there with your friends, looking out over the yard like it was your kingdom, felt like the safest place in the world, even if it wasn't. At family gatherings, it wasn't unusual for a kid to get handed a tiny sip of beer or wine, just to taste it. Maybe it was Grandpa's way of being funny, or an uncle winking and saying, "It'll put hair on your chest." The grown-ups got a laugh, and the kid usually made a face. Nobody thought about health studies or the message it might send. It was just part of the loose, good-natured atmosphere. Back then, The line between kids' and adults' worlds was a lot blurrier, and moments like this were seen as harmless, even a little rite of passage. In states where it was still legal, you could pull up to a farm, hand over a couple of dollars, and walk away with a jug of unpasteurized milk, straight from the cow that morning. No fancy labels, no expiration date, just a cold, creamy drink in a glass bottle or an old jug. Some swore it tasted better, richer. Others said it was healthier. There were risks, sure, but folks trusted the farmer. You knew exactly which cow it came from. Nowadays, it's tightly regulated, often banned. But back then, it was just part of life in dairy country. Asbestos was the miracle material, fireproof, insulating, and practically everywhere. Attics, walls, pipes, you name it, someone wrapped it in asbestos. The soft, fibrous stuff looked harmless, almost like fuzzy fabric. You could poke it with your finger, no gloves or mask, and think nothing of it. Contractors swore by it, homeowners bragged about it, and nobody talked about what it did to your lungs. It kept the heat in during the winter, the cool in during the summer, and nobody imagined it could harm them. Today, we treat it like a biohazard. Back then, it was just good building practice. Shooting tin cans off a fence was practically a rite of passage. You'd line them up on the posts, grab your .22, and spend an afternoon plinking away. The sound of a can clanging and tumbling to the ground was pure satisfaction. Nobody called the police, and nobody worried about noise ordinances. You just made sure you weren't aiming toward the neighbor's barn. It was target practice, plain and simple, and everyone thought it was harmless fun. Today, you'd have a SWAT team at your door in half an hour. But back then, it was just another lazy Saturday. Lighting up in a grocery store was as normal as grabbing a cart. You could stroll down the produce aisle with a cigarette in hand, trailing smoke past the apples and bread. Some stores had ashtrays near the checkout, and clerks smoked between customers. The air was a mix of tobacco, coffee, and whatever was baking in the deli. Nobody covered their nose or complained. It was just part of the smell of shopping. Now, it seems insane, but in the 50s, it was as common as hearing the butcher call out your name for a fresh cut of meat. Cribs back then had wide slats and designs that would never pass inspection today. Some were placed right under open windows with no guards or stops. On hot summer nights, parents thought nothing of leaving the window wide open for air. Kids could stick their arms, or worse, their heads, between the bars. We didn't have safety recalls or warning labels. It was just the way cribs were built. And somehow, most of us survived with nothing worse than a bump or a bruise. Though today, parents wouldn't let such a design through the front door, let alone into a nursery. In rural areas, you could walk into a hardware store and buy dynamite without much more than a handshake. It was used for blasting stumps, clearing rocks, or even breaking up frozen ground in the winter. The sticks came in neat little boxes, and fuses hung in spools by the register. No background check, no license, just a friendly, "Be careful with that." It wasn't until 1970 that federal laws really clamped down. Before that, a farm shed could have a few sticks right next to the fertilizer, and nobody thought twice about it. Toddlers on tricycles would pedal around the driveway, sometimes only a few feet from traffic. Parents sat on the porch, sipping coffee, trusting the little ones to stay put, or at least hoping drivers were paying attention. There were no bright plastic safety barriers, no helmets, no reflective vests. The trikes were all metal, heavy and solid, and every fall left a new dent. You learned early to steer clear of the road, usually by trial and error. Today, we'd build a fence before letting that happen. But back then, it was just how kids learned their boundaries. Candy cigarettes were a kid's favorite, a little chalky, a little sweet, and shaped exactly like the real thing. You could walk into the corner store, drop a few pennies, and walk out pretending you were a movie star. Parents might even send you to buy them as a treat. Nobody worried it might encourage smoking. It was just a harmless novelty. You'd blow powdered sugar smoke through your lips and feel grown up for a minute. Today, they're almost impossible to find, but in the 50s, they were just another snack in the glass case by the register. During parades, some parents let their kids climb right onto the roof of the family car for a better view. You'd wave at the marching band, toss candy back to the clowns, and feel like the king of the world up there. The car would inch along the curb, and nobody thought it was dangerous, just festive. Today, police would shut it down in seconds, but back then, it was part of the fun. You got the best seat in the house, the sun on your face, and the rumble of the parade right below your feet. Mercury thermometers were the standard, and sometimes they doubled as entertainment. Shake them to bring the silver bead down. Watch it slide back up as it warmed in your mouth. Nobody thought much about the glass shattering or the toxic metal inside. If one broke, you'd chase the shiny little balls across the floor with your finger, marveling at how they rolled. It wasn't hazardous material to us. It was just fascinating. Now, the idea of letting kids handle mercury would send people into a panic. But back then, it was just another curiosity in the bathroom cabinet. By the late 50s, a few high schools started putting vending machines in the halls, usually selling soda, candy bars, and gum. It was still rare, but if your school had one, you were a celebrity with spare change. You'd buy a cold glass bottle of cola between classes, maybe sneak a candy bar into study hall. Teachers rarely stopped you, and nobody counted calories or sugar. In the 70s, they'd be everywhere, but in the 50s, they felt downright futuristic, like your school was ahead of the times. Parents would run into a store, leaving the kids in the car with the windows cracked, sometimes for half an hour or more. You'd sit in the front seat, honking the horn for fun, pretending to drive, or reading a comic book. In winter, you might keep the heater running. In summer, you sweated it out. Nobody called the police or worried about kidnappers. It was just how errands got done. Today, the idea would cause outrage, but back then, you were expected to wait patiently until Mom or Dad came back with the groceries. Building your own go-kart meant scavenging wheels from an old wagon, wood from the shed, and maybe an engine if you were lucky. Once it ran, you raced it down the street. No helmets, no brakes worth mentioning. Neighbors stood on their porches and watched you fly by, hoping you didn't hit a parked car. If you wiped out, you dusted yourself off and tried again. Today, it would be banned on sight, but back then, it was just another way to spend a Saturday and maybe test your luck with gravity. Shooting BB guns in empty lots was a common pastime. You and your friends would set up bottles, cans, or paper targets and take turns firing away. Nobody wore safety goggles, and the only rule was not to shoot each other, though even that sometimes got tested. Parents might wander by, offer a tip on aim, and keep walking. Police didn't bother you unless you were breaking windows. Today, the sight of a kid with a BB gun in town would bring instant alarm. But back then, it was as normal as riding your bike after school. Tackle football in the street was a regular thing. No pads, no helmets, no referees. The asphalt doubled as both the field and the injury report. Skinned knees, scraped elbows, and the occasional twisted ankle. Cars would roll through, and you'd scatter to the curb, then jump back in as soon as they passed. The end zones were driveways, and the rules changed depending on who had the ball. It wasn't safe, but it was fun, and that's all that mattered. Smoking wasn't confined to one corner of the office, it was everywhere. Elevators had ashtrays, department stores sold clothes under a haze of smoke, and the click of a Zippo was just part of the background noise. You'd hold a cigarette while you typed, answered phones, or even fitted customers for shoes. The smell clung to everything, and nobody thought it was a problem. Today, you can't light up within 20 feet of a doorway, but back then, the workplace practically doubled as a smoking lounge. If an old refrigerator or washing machine stopped working, some folks just rolled it to the edge of a ravine or dumped it in a river. Nobody talked about environmental impact. It was just getting rid of junk. You might even find an unofficial dumping spot in the woods where half the town's appliances went to rest. Today, we'd call it illegal dumping. Back then, it was just cleaning out the shed. A loaded shotgun behind the kitchen door was as common as a broom. It was there for pests, varmints, or the occasional unwelcome visitor. Kids knew not to touch it, at least in theory, and guests hardly noticed. Nobody locked it in a safe or fitted it with a trigger lock. It was just part of the household, like a cast iron skillet or a winter coat. Coal furnaces kept homes warm, but they left behind buckets of ash. Most folks just dumped the ashes in the yard, along the driveway, or even into the garden. It kept ice down in winter and added grit to muddy spots. Nobody thought about where it all went come spring. It was just part of the rhythm of heating your home. Riding on the tailgate of a moving car felt like flying. You'd hop up, dangle your feet over the edge, and grip the metal with both hands as the wind whipped past. Sometimes it was just a lazy roll down a dusty country lane. Other times, a slow cruise right through the middle of town, waving at neighbors as you passed. No seat belts, no warnings, no one shouting about safety. It was just another way to get from here to there. Sure, you might hit a bump and hang on for dear life, but that was part of the fun. Teenagers could land part-time jobs running machinery that would make an OSHA inspector faint today. Lathes, table saws, drill presses, meat slicers. If you were big enough to reach the controls, the boss figured you were ready. Safety guards were often missing, and training might be a 2-minute demonstration before you were left alone. Parents didn't complain. They saw it as learning responsibility and building a work ethic. Sure, there were scrapes and close calls, but those were considered part of growing up. Today, half those machines would be locked behind safety cages, but back then, a paycheck was worth the risk. Burning trash in an open barrel was just how you got rid of it. Everyone had one out back, an old oil drum with holes punched in the sides for airflow. You'd toss in paper, leaves, food scraps, even plastic, strike a match, and let it smolder all afternoon. The smoke curled lazily into the sky, carrying that unmistakable burnt smell for blocks. Nobody called to complain, because they were probably burning their own. Kids stood nearby poking at the ashes with sticks, and no one thought twice. Trash trucks came once a week if you were lucky. This was faster, cheaper, and normal. Leftover paint thinner or chemicals? You didn't store them, and you sure didn't haul them to some special disposal site. You just picked a corner of the yard or maybe the gravel driveway and poured them out. If it went down the storm drain, all the better. Gone in seconds. Nobody thought of groundwater or long-term hazards. The rainbow sheen swirling on the puddle afterward was almost pretty, like oil-painted water. Kids might even poke at it with sticks, watching the color shift. It wasn't seen as dangerous. It was simply how you got rid of things you didn't need anymore.